The alumni featured in this installment of Boston Latin School's oral history walked their corridors 6 decades ago. They bridged the years of the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Years characterized by prosperity, conformity, and optimism on the one hand, and uncertainty, dissent, and disquiet on the other. All the while, these young men experienced their formative years of adolescence in the forge of Boston Latin School. The values and lessons imparted on them would form their own lives and those of their city and nation. Welcome, my name is Christian Lariche, and I'm the class president of Boston Latin School's class of 2022. My classmates and I just completed our time at the Latin School and are very proud to join the ranks of graduate alumni. We endured the disruptions of a global pandemic and now enter a world fraught with complicated and competing interests and ideas. What will our perspectives be decades from now? And how will we look upon our time as Latin School students? Will our stories resemble those portrayed here? The testimonies of those you are about to hear ensure that we can someday answer that question. We now continue with Chapter 3 of Generationes Virtutes, an oral history of Boston Latin School.
When a person passes through a great institution like this one, it changes you and it stays with you.
I came from West Roxbury back in the 60s and 50s, almost exclusively an Irish enclave.
The area I grew up in had people from all over the world, that is, the world as we knew it then, which meant Europe.
My neighborhood was Irish or Italian.
Predominantly Irish Catholic, but there were Italians on the street.
A lot of kids had come in from West Roxbury, kids from Dorchester. In my class 6, we had 36 full chairs. 4 of the kids were African American.
As I understood at that time, that there were people in Boston who lived in other neighborhoods that would hurt me because I was black, and they weren't safe for me to go there. And I mean, I'm a kid. How do I know? So by the time I get to Boston Latin School, I'm a little confused about things, to say the least. And I wasn't sure that leaving the neighborhood was the best idea at that time. But the people who were important to me thought it was important that I go.
I had kind of a nice experience, and mainly because my homeroom teacher was Connie Jameson. How could a 6E have a better deal of it than to get Connie Jameson for homeroom teacher? He gave me a nickname, Jake, that immediately gave me acceptance. He was the first teacher that spoke to us about racism. There was one African American in the room. We would titter and, be unkind. Connie sent him down to the office. He just ripped into us. You're not smarter than them because you're a different color than them. You're not better than them. You're the same. You're all the same. Really expanded the city for me quite a bit.
Exposure to people at a young age who were different than I. They were different religion, different race, different this and that.
So now I had friends in Charlestown, North End, Southie, Dorchester. It really made you cosmopolitan within the boundaries of Boston, at least.
The degree of socialization I had in the neighborhood decreased significantly. All my buddies gave me their condolences because they had heard about the amount of work.
Well, we were expected to do a minimum of 3 hours of homework a night.
But I always found it to be about 3 to 5 hours. Essentially, it took me out of the neighborhood from September through June.
I was always doing a lot of it on the bus on the way in. In grammar school, I could kind of just absorb things, didn't pay a lot of attention to do any homework. I found out when I got to Latin school, I couldn't get away with that anymore. I actually had to do the homework. So from that perspective, I had less time available to kind of hang around with my local friends.
In one of my German classes, the professor would give flyers, he called them. It was based on 400 irregular verbs. They were worth 5 points, but there were always 10 questions. And you had to get 5 right to get to 0. Usually the first few weeks of class, you're owing him points. So you had to work pretty hard to dig your way out of that.
The most intimidating words in Latin school language were, "Gentlemen, all books on the floor." That meant sneak quiz on last night's homework. And you would hear yells of agony throughout the room for students who might not have been as well prepared as they should have been.
All my buddies were out playing stickball or hide and seek or whatever they were doing in those days, and I was home trying to figure out Latin.
When I started Latin at Boston Latin School, my father, who wanted to make sure I was prepared, would go to the Copley Library and bring extra passages home my freshman year for me to translate. I wouldn't have to have it done the next day like homework. I got 2 days, but I had to have it done. So the general rule was work first, and I didn't get to play as much, but it was my choice to go, so I had to pay the price to go.
When you came to school on the first day of the academic year, you went to your homeroom. Your homeroom teacher greeted you, and he would say, "Relax, boys, we're going to have a good year together." He said, "And now I'm going to show you your set of teachers." Well, your set, the set meant your 5 or 6 teachers for the year. And that determined your whole quality of life for the next 9 months. And so there'd be a moment of great tension. And so when that board came down, the screams of horror or delight filled the room. Mostly horror. "Oh my God, no!" And kids, then they'd go into these great histrionics, pretending to fall off their seats, burying their heads in their desks. And it was mostly comical, but every once in a while, you knew that you're in for a hard 9 months with one of these people up on the board. Latin school is a teacher of teachers. And there's a teaching impulse that comes from these great teachers like Sid Rosenthal, Mad Frank, Joseph Desmond.
As a generality, teachers at Latin school weren't what I would call cuddly or helpful.
They were fair, they were hard, very often they were stern. They would loosen up a little bit in the spring after you had proved yourself. And then afterward, if you bump into the corridor the next year, they were very supportive. "How are you doing? Keep it up. Let's go. Tell me where you're going to college."
One that I remember particularly was Peter Cozadoy. Peter Cozadoy was a math teacher and just a fine gentleman beyond that. But I was involved in an organization called the Key Club at the time. And he kind of showed me what it meant to be involved in a life of service, if you will. I think the result of that was that ultimately I wound up in a life of service as a doctor. You know, and I've always thought back to his influence on me in that respect.
The teacher that I liked the most and listened to a lot was McNamara. He was not a disciplinarian. He wasn't out to, at least in my view, trying to make life sort of difficult as many of the teachers around here did. What he was interested in was to get his students involved and develop a love of reading. And he kept talking about how improving your vocabulary was a thing that you could do for the rest of your life. And that really resonated with me.
The very first homeroom teacher that I had, Mr. Partridge, impacted me in 2 important ways. One, he was a very nice man, and also he was a Latin teacher. That was the thing that I enjoyed most as a discipline while I was at Boston Latin School. It's one of the things that had the longest impact on me. So when I got to college, I could read Lucretius' The Nature of Things. And that philosophy got me interested in studying philosophy in college and in psychology. All because of the joy that Mr. Partridge had in that discipline. I was just lucky to have him as a homeroom teacher.
Class 5, I had a legendary English teacher named Frank Sullivan. He was at the school for about 25 years. He had been there about 15 years when I had him. He was affectionately known as Mad Frank throughout the school culture. And Mad Frank worked you hard, day in and day out. He emphasized vocabulary and grammar. Mad Frank had a sign under his clock which said, "Time will pass, comma, with you, question mark." Every time you looked up to say, "When's this class going to end?" you saw his sign. He tried to be a tough guy, and for about 4 months he pulled it off. He would say, "Gentlemen, don't be fooled by my appearance. Beneath this rough exterior beats a heart of stone." And he would laugh. And he used all 42 minutes of every period. Even before the bell rang, he was telling kids to go to the board and start diagramming sentences.
Probably the teacher with the most difficult reputation at Latin school was an individual by the name of Dr. Roach. And to kind of give you an example of what he was like, he would give a test every week, and it'd be a 5-point test. So if you translated it perfectly and missed the syntax questions, you get a 0. So he was a very difficult marker. On one occasion, I know I got a 2, and I went up to see him in homeroom period and said, "I think I got the following syntax question right and I should have a 3. He quickly gave me a half a dozen reasons why I didn't know what he was talking about and sent me back to my seat. As I was about to sit down, he said to me, "Ryan, don't feel bad. Someday you'll be a PhD." And I said, "Well, thank you, Dr. Roach." And he said, "Yeah, someday you'll be a post-hole digger."
Most of my really other positive experiences were with coaches. Coach McCarthy, he was in track and football. Coach Lambert was a football coach. And there was another coach who didn't teach at Boston Latin School. He didn't. He was, Mr. Gums was a phys ed teacher at Timothy High School, but he coached football. He probably had the biggest influence on me because he taught me about the importance of preparation, fundamentals, and hard work. In fact, the things he made me learn is why I was recruited to Bowdoin College.
Athletics at the school were another powerful influence. And in those days, Latin was an athletic powerhouse.
Athletics were terrific. My senior year, the football team was undefeated, loaded with all scholastics.
Especially in football. During my 6 years at the school, we had 3 undefeated teams. We played against English, a very formidable and distinguished school, an arch rival. And the football game on Thanksgiving morning usually carried 20 to 28,000 people in the stands. In 1959, both teams were undefeated, and the attendance at Harvard Stadium that morning was 28,000.
If I've had success in life, I got to put a lot of it to going through Latin school, the sacrifices I had to make.
I guess the best way to describe it is that it was good for me, but not necessarily good to me as an experience.
If I could say there was one thing you really got out of Latin school, it was you had to think.
This place is completely different today than it was in my day, and for the better.
After my parents, it's the single most formative force in my life, and that I see the world through a Latin school lens. Be very analytical, be rational, be tolerant, be, above all, fair. The older I get, the more I think about all of Latin school. School stays with you. You may be here briefly, 6 years in the life of the school, but it's with you for 70 to 80 years in your life if you're lucky enough to live that long.